Hello and welcome to episode 22 of the Fight for the Future podcast. As always, remember to like this video and subscribe to the channel if you want more content like this. And also know that this content is available on Spotify and Apple Podcasts as well. So if you want to listen to the audio version, you can go there and check that out. And it's also available on a ton of other podcast platforms. It's RSS, so pretty much any podcast app has our podcast in it. Today's episode is about a recent announcement from Apple that they'll begin scanning iPhone photo libraries for child abuse content. This issue, the issue is that this is a massive and unwarranted violation of their users' privacy and an unprecedented step toward undetectable total surveillance on one of the most popular mobile platforms in the world. A major concern here is that if Apple is able to get this through on iPhone, that it will inevitably spread to other platforms like OS X, Windows, and Android, and it will be like a slippery slope from here, where it starts at protection of children, but it could go to dissent of governments, tracking of protesters, and silencing of free speech. And just general abuse, of the surveillance technology. Today, we are lucky to have Holmes Wilson, who's the co-founder of Fight for the Future, here to discuss this with us today. We're going to have Ken Mickles, but he was unable to attend today, so maybe we'll catch him another time, but we are certainly missing him here. Holmes, can you give us an overview of how this all started? Did Apple just randomly announce that they were going to start scanning user photos, or was there, warning before this, or were we able to see this coming in a way?
Okay, so I believe where it started was a security expert and someone I am sort of work with occasionally and connected to through the Zcash community. He's also one of the founding scientists of the Zcash cryptocurrency, a private cryptocurrency. The security researcher, Matthew Green, started, I think, getting leaked information or insider information through contacts in the security community that Apple was about to announce this. That was, I believe, Wednesday or Thursday mid last week. And I think Apple's public announcement was Friday. But it was really interesting because there are these tweets from Matt Green saying, okay, Apple is about to enable client-side scanning based on a list of hashes for child sexual abuse material. No company has ever done this before. This is a terrible idea. Matthew Green is also one of the leading voices, or has been one of the leading voices for the right to encrypt. And so, for example, going back to the Apple FBI fight that in 2015 that Fight for the Future played a big role in. Matt Green would have been, one of the leading voices saying, Apple's right on this. The right to encrypt is important. We can't be adding backdoors. Backdoors would be a disaster. And it sort of comes around full circle where he's hearing through these back channels that Apple is about to release. Apple itself, without being compelled directly by the government, is about to release a major backdoor in its own stuff, and starts tweeting about it. And then, the Apple announcement comes on Friday. And since then, I think Apple is famous for having a circle of extremely passionate fans that are very vocal and very often, defensive is maybe too harsh, just often will vigorously defend Apple whenever something, whenever they make some misstep or announce something controversial, and you can, see folks. Fight for the Future will get responses from Apple fans along these lines. Maybe some of them are watching this video right now, but and you see on Hacker News people vigorously defend Apple when things like this come up. I have never seen anything like what I've seen in the past week, in terms of even the most diehard Apple supporters, at least among technically aware people, saying this is wrong, this is a terrible idea, and this is extremely dangerous, and this makes me want to never buy an Apple product ever again. And get the one I have out of my life as soon as possible. So it's been really significant. And I think that's because people understand that while the stated reason for doing this is, I don't want to say noble exactly, because there's leading voices in the security community who are focused on the problem of child sexual abuse material, who are saying that this isn't actually, folks like Alex Stamos, former Facebook security, who's now independent, saying that this is isn't really, it's kind of coming out of left field, and it's not really on the main line of where most people are thinking in terms of the best way to address this problem. So, but Apple certainly it's potentially a justifiable reason to take aggressive steps, but the aggressiveness of the step that they're taking changes so fundamentally the relationship between the software and hardware maker and the user, especially in the context of Apple's total control over the platform, where you can't change anything about the way your device works at this level when you have an Apple device. That people are just people who normally would defend Apple seem universally mix of terrified and disgusted that Apple is doing this.
Where do you think this is coming from? Like, do you think that there's pressure from law enforcement? I remember when we were doing the Apple campaign around, phone encryption, and the FBI was strongly urging Apple to build a backdoor. This feels very similar. This feels like another version of an encryption backdoor where, you can have your content on your phone, and they want an ability to, see into that content without, they're saying that, that we can get into the mechanics a little bit, but from what I understand, there isn't a person in a desk looking at individual like JPEGs on your phone. They're looking for some sort of cryptographic marker or some sort of like digital marker on the files. What changed between 2015 when Apple themselves was saying, encryption backdoors are dangerous. We shouldn't just allow these things to be built, to now where they are building an arguably a form of a backdoor into private user data. What do you think is going on behind the scenes that made this happen?
Well, I'd say, I think first of all, I should say that and I want to be clear about this, because any viewer, trying to figure this issue out deserves to know this. That I'm, my current role is I'm on the board of Fight for the Future. I participate actively in conversation. I follow voices in the security community. I follow academic work in the security community to a degree. I'm working on a project now that has to do with that is building an encrypted alternative to Slack and Discord. And I'm also on a committee that funds work on a private cryptocurrency. So there are ways in which I'm sort of in this scene. And of course, my history co-leading Fight for the Future for 8 or so years, through the Apple FBI fight and through the Snowden revelations. Like, I have a lot of context on this, but despite that, I don't have any insider information. So I don't have any special awareness on this that someone else couldn't get just by reading the news or following Twitter over the past week. And this has all been unfolding pretty quickly. So I would say, you should think of what I'm saying, any viewer or listener should think of what I'm saying as like, someone who's following the same news that they are, but maybe with a lot of context, but without any access to specific information. But the context I have is, there's Apple versus FBI. There's also an incident a bit later, I think this is already during the Trump administration, that's really significant, where Reuters reports that Apple was planning to, or Reuters reports that Apple shelved plans to end-to-end encrypt iCloud, that is to encrypt users' iCloud backups with a locally controlled key that Apple did not have access to, so that Apple would be storing the photos and backed up messages and things like that, but would not have access to them. That Apple abandoned a plan, an internal plan to do that, that was, according to Reuters, very close to being implemented, like pretty far along, because of pushback from the administration, from and I assume that means DOJ or White House. And so there's that. So we know one piece of context here that's important is that Apple has shown interest in building a version of iCloud that's based in user-controlled keys. Another piece of context is that law enforcement is, whatever we see in the press and public, is a kind of tip of the iceberg, and federal level law enforcement, probably especially domestic law enforcement in the US at the level of the FBI, is pressuring all major tech companies for more access. They're screaming about the problem of going dark. They're saying, we won't be able to catch the bad guys anymore unless you give us access. And some of that fight is spilling over into the public, but be sure that a lot of it is happening behind the scenes. And that there are many kinds of implicit threats being made against these companies, that if they don't make it easier for law enforcement to give access, then some other, the law enforcement is going to give them a hard time in some way, or maybe even, I think it's reasonable to think that, in some cases, the government could be saying, make it easier for us to get access, or we'll hurt you in some other way, in some other area of your business, through regulation or something like that. I think that's certainly the type of environment that the telephone operators are in. That's why AT&T and Verizon and those folks were so happily giving customer call metadata to the government, even though they didn't have to be, just because of that kind of relationship with the government, where they're highly regulated and the government can hurt them. As tech comes under more scrutiny and more regulation, I think there's that threat of quid pro quo. Anyways, that's one piece of the context. But the iCloud encryption thing is especially important, because the weird thing about what Apple just announced is that if Apple, given the way iCloud works right now, if Apple wanted to scan everybody's iCloud images, or iCloud images and messages and whatever, for certain image files using some algorithm they've cooked up, they could do that right now. They don't have to scan client side. They could do it in the cloud. And so what most folks who are looking at this are speculating, my first speculation, and I've seen this speculation elsewhere, is that this is something Apple is doing in advance of announcing user-controlled keys for iCloud encryption. So, the administration changes, there's a new team in the White House. Apple thinks they can push this through or hold up, make the public case better in this environment. They're not quite as scared of the Biden administration as they were of the Trump administration, where they think they have a handle on it. And they're planning to revamp this plan that they had before, which honestly is a great plan, one that we would support. Every company should be doing this. All your cloud backups should be encrypted with user control keys. And in order to kind of balance things out a bit, they've focused on a specifically horrendous area of online harm. And they've said, okay, we're doing iCloud encryption, but we're going to do client-side scanning but first we're going to put in place client-side scanning, so that, because presumably they already are doing scanning on iCloud for child sexual abuse material. They're just not like talking about it. They don't have to tell anyone about it. They're doing it. No one would object to it. But if they're about to announce encryption, that would shut down the ability to do cloud-side scanning. Or once they announce user-controlled encryption of iCloud backups, that would shut down the ability to do cloud-side scanning. So if they have client-side scanning in place first, then they're in a stronger position to make the case to the government that this isn't going to be disruptive to the most important kinds of, or to investigations or attempts to stop or catch the most important kinds of harms. Yeah, and so there's this other thing wrapped into all this that we haven't really talked about, which is the sort of child safety protections that are different from the client-side scanning for child sexual abuse material, but are more like some AI that's trying to see if image or video is, or piece of media either coming in or going out from the phone is sexual in nature and optionally warrants the parents, that's an entirely different can of worms. And honestly, like, I think that's significant, but it's something that I'm not a leading voice on, I'm not qualified to speak on. I would just say that it's extremely fraught and delicate, and Apple should be doing that kind of thing in open consultation with a community of experts in this field, and not just rolling out some, you know, just kind of on a Friday telling everybody that they have some new crazy plan. But I think the main focus for Fight for the Future is probably going to be the client-side scanning. So anyway, that's some important context. And and the biggest piece of context I think that everyone should look at is that this is all happening in the context of Apple's total control over their platform. So the control that Apple has over their devices is completely unprecedented in the history of general purpose computers. You know, at its worst, the Microsoft monopoly in the 90s never would have dared to limit someone's ability to install software on their phone, to limit someone's ability to change what operating system was on their computer. You know, can you imagine in the 90s if Microsoft said, you know, you buy an Intel-based computer and we've locked it down so that you can only run Windows on it. You can't even, you know, mess with installing Linux or something like that. Forget it. That would have been completely beyond the pale in that era. And yet Apple, because of the monopoly type environment that they inherited from the phone carriers, where, you know, we couldn't install anything on our phones before iPhone for the most part, they were able to normalize that level of control. So now when they take steps like these, it really puts users in this position of like you cannot, the only thing you can do is, you know, smash your phone with a hammer. There's nothing you can do to protect yourself against this functionality being misused now or in the future to hurt you or to hurt others.
Yeah, I was curious about like alternative options for users, especially in light of how controlled the iOS ecosystem is. Like, is there a possibility that there could be, you know, an encrypted photo app that has the camera built into it that locally is encrypting these files? I mean, it sounds like what's happening is it's just scanning all image files on your device.
It's the ones that are connected to iCloud. All right, so
okay.
So yeah, it's the ones that are being backed up to iCloud, I think, and I'm not sure where the line. Well, so there's two things. So there's right now, and there's what the capability implies or opens the door to, and what Apple could choose to do in the future, either voluntarily in response to a crisis or compelled to by a government, potentially the government, you know, the US government or governments in the EU or elsewhere. So in terms of what it does right now, it's doing, you know, it's only scanning for this database of images that is provided by this organization that has a sort of special remit to be the grand repository of all discovered child sexual abuse material online. And it's doing that using an algorithm that's completely opaque and no one really, you know, a few people have maybe reviewed, but there's no, outside of Apple, but there's been no general review of an algorithm that is not a cryptographic hashing algorithm. So it's designed to have what they call hash collisions, where the algorithm will mistake one thing for another. And it's designed to do that specifically in the case where an image has been like cropped or shifted a bit, or, you know, encoded, re-encoded, where the file properties have changed in some way, so that it can sort of cast a wider net in terms of finding these photos. But that possibility of collisions, when tech is deployed at the scale of billions of people or, you know, billion users, will inevitably, you know, just by the virtue of odds, come up with false positives, and it might come up with enough false positives that somebody who did not have child sexual abuse material on their phone is now being looked at by law enforcement as if they were someone who did, which is an extremely dangerous situation. And we don't know how many people that's going to happen to, or what jurisdictions they're going to be in, or what kind of damage they're going to face. So that's what Apple is doing now. The capability that they're introducing, though, is obviously much broader than that. What they're doing in there is nothing when you receive software from a software vendor and that software is updating automatically the way you would want your operating system to update automatically, or the way you want essential apps you use to update automatically, or at least so frequently that you approve the updates as soon as they appear for security reasons. What's happening in that relationship is that they have the ability to push code to you that you're not reviewing every update. Like in the case of something closed source like Apple, you can't. You're trusting them. And so in putting code on your device, in saying to the world that, in Apple saying to the world, we are now a company that will, through this trusted update process that no one can really get out of if they want their device to be minimally secure, we are going to start pushing code that you would probably not want there and that works against you and that could accidentally send you to jail. Or even given the limited targeting that they're doing now, could accidentally send you to jail. And then, in some totally imaginable future crisis where a broader set of prohibited material gets added to that list of things that this code is checking for on your phone, could intentionally send you to jail for something you did not deserve to go to jail for example, activism, journalism, whistleblowing, the list goes on. That's crossing a huge line.
I was going to ask about that. Like the way that things work for Apple is, they're very much at the whims of the governments in the territories that they are selling hardware in and software in. And, they build this tool for one thing, but there's no guarantee that, a government isn't going to turn around and say, look for these spreadsheets on these computers for, activists or whatever. And it's sort of, they're building the foundation for a pretty advanced surveillance system on people's private machines. And this is also speculating that, this will eventually go to desktop computers and, Windows and things like that. I guess, so if this isn't stopped, in your opinion, how long until this tech makes it to other platforms?
Well, if the other platforms have people who have a brain and a conscience, then ideally forever. Right. I think this thing is totally self-inflicted on Apple's part. I think the fact that they had the temerity to do this, the just sheer hubris to do this, it links in a lot of ways to what we know about their company culture. The fact that they didn't consult with anybody before they did this links to a lot of what we know about their company culture. And I think so. I think my hope for the world is that would Google do something like this? I don't think, I'm not 100% sure that they wouldn't, but I certainly think there's a lot of people there who would be disgusted by it and would never consider doing this and would advocate extremely strongly against it. And I think, we would see a really active conversation happening in public before it happened. So, I think that is certainly part of the slippery slope, is that if we let Apple do this, then everybody else, it will become normalized and everyone else will do it. Another pathway is that if we let Apple do it, then that empowers government, that gives government either informally or in the public, sort of in the public debate, in the realm of public debate, which includes a lot of folks who don't understand the tech and how dangerous this is, who might be fooled by the government, or in the realm of the courts to say, look, this technology is normal. Apple's doing it. It's already deployed. It's safe. So we're going to require that you do it too. Could happen through legislation too. And of course, the first type of court action or legislation we'll see will be related to something horrific, like there's this kind of old, I think it goes back to the 90s. and I really should know who coined this term, but they say the four horsemen of the infocalypse or something, the information apocalypse. The four horsemen of the information apocalypse are the boogeyman, or the sort of demonic dangers and threats that will force societies and political systems, or tempt societies and political systems to crack down on information in such a broad way that it harms all these adjacent uses of all these adjacent kinds of freedom and safety that people have online. Those would be terrorism, child pornography, hackers or something, and I forget the last one. But anyway, there are these things that are sort of objects of fear that are raised up every once in a while, and depending on the season, they sort of change. But whenever a government wants to expand their power over tech, they raise one of these scary figures, and in some ways, those sort of scary figures are always there, even in a democratic sense, to kind of scare people and tempt them into shutting down freedom or privacy online in ways that are overbroad, that hurt everybody much more broadly. So anyway, that's probably the threat will probably come through one of those, if it comes through the courts or comes through legislation, it's going to be tied to some specific thing that seems terrible, but then once it passes, it will end up getting broadened and used for other things. The same way, the NSA surveillance starts that way. And whenever there's a threat like terrorism, or threat like foreign spying first, and then terrorism, then domestic terrorism, then they use it for the drug war, then they use it for others, through parallel construction. It gets in through something really serious, then pries open and spreads out to things that are much more venal. And then, and of course, along the way, you have stories of NSA employees using it, or in some cases, local law enforcement using it to spy on, and using this infrastructure to spy on and abuse their exes, or romantic interests, right? So it goes in through that spike and broadens. So I think that's the real threat here. That's a context that everybody understands. That's, I think, the certainly one that Apple understands, and it doesn't mean that. The fact that we're worried about that happening does not mean that it's inevitable. So if Apple keeps this in place, that does not mean that it's normal. That does not mean that it's okay. That does not mean that the other tech companies are going to do it or have to do it. That is still an open question. And if there are people at those companies with a conscience, they will not do it. But certainly if we want to make sure that it doesn't happen, we should fight this now. Sorry, I got notifications coming in too. Sorry for that.
Oh, it's all good. So, I could see, in a worst case scenario, a disgruntled Apple employee looking for specific types of metadata or something, if that's even possible with this tech. Like the capability for abuse of non-state abuse is huge and really scary. And that's, I think, a big reason why we always advocate just don't build this. Like, just don't even make software that has this capability. It's to me, it's super irresponsible to even build stuff like this.
Yeah, and I think another piece of context that I wanted to add is this organization NCMEC, which I think people pronounce as NCMEC, but the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. So again, I'm saying this as just someone who's following the news lately and has a lot of context in this space. I don't have any special knowledge of this organization, just beyond what's in Wikipedia. But they're kind of quasi-governmental, non-governmental organization. They're funded by an act through Congress. They sort of exist in this special state where they're the organization that does a bunch of things, but it is the sort of clearinghouse for cases of sexual abuse material found online. And they're the folks that you would report it to, I believe, as well. If you're a service provider, I think you are required to report it if you see it. This is who you would report to. So different service providers will have relationships with this organization. But I don't know, some helpful context is that this organization is probably pretty close to law enforcement. They probably are active in a community of people that includes people at the FBI, DOJ and maybe, some intelligence agencies. And if you look at their website, that some of their supporters include like companies like Palantir or listed as partners on their website include companies like Palantir or Celebrity. I forget, it's a stupid name and I don't know how to pronounce it, but the company that sort of like the America's NSO group, the company that builds hacking tools for.
It didn't Celebrate build the 0-day exploit for the iPhone, the brightly colored iPhone models that they were trying to get into?
Yeah, yeah, that's right. They're the company that makes that makes the tool where if your phone is seized by the cops in the US, they'll use this to unlock it. And so let's see, it's possible, again, in the sort of tip of the iceberg sense, it's possible this organization has pretty deep relationships with law enforcement, and that there are some folks in law enforcement who might just want to advance surveillance powers generally, who would think of working with NCMEC as like a way to kind of move that ball forward, and where they're all kind of on the same team. So I don't know that, but that's kind of my sense. And that's probably more at the leadership level and not at the level of like, yeah.
Speaking of hacks and stuff, can you detail just a little bit? I know that we're not like super in, like, I know that we might not be able to give a super detailed overview, but can you give us a little bit of information about like Pegasus and how it relates to all of this?
Yeah. So this has been a really wild year for Apple, where we finally kicked off by the Epic lawsuit. We finally start having the public debate that, well, some of us have been having for years, but it finally starts to become a broad public debate about Apple's unprecedented and extremely destructive and damaging and almost like megalomaniacal control over the devices that they sell, and the radical assertion that even when they sell you an iPhone, they own it forever, actually, and because they control the software on it, you don't have the right to control the software on it. That public debate finally starts this year, right? And then it sort of quickly goes into the courts, and nobody's really talking as much about it publicly. Fight for the Future has been involved in it, in trying to draw attention to the problem. But so that's sort of been working its way through. But then you have the NSO group in Pegasus leaks from a few weeks ago, where Amnesty International and Citizen Lab learn the list of targets of this set of malware tools that the Israel-based company NSO Group has been selling to governments all around the world for years, and law enforcement agencies. And that predictably has been used primarily to target the enemies of those governments, which include local journalists, dissidents, and even more broadly than that, like in some cases, some people on the target list were like the spouses or family members of leaders in authoritarian regimes. So that leak happens. And this is, and the backdrop for that is that NSO has been, everybody knows that NSO is selling to total dirtbags, and NSO who used total kind of authoritarian, monstrous authoritarian governments, and that these tools have been linked to assassinations and imprisonment of journalists and activists. But NSO Group has kept denying it, saying, no, we only sell to human rights approved folks, and you're not allowed to use this or that you're not allowed to do this or that with our tools. But we finally get the list of their targets, and surprise, surprise, it includes human rights activists and journalists. But the really interesting thing about the NSO leak for Apple, that was a sort of main piece of the story. But a piece of the story that was often overlooked and that I was trying to kind of get more attention to at the time was that the main vector for hacks in practice, when governments were using this tech to hack the phone of an activist or a journalist or a family member, the vector was iMessages. The way they would get in were no click exploits on iMessages, which means it's not like you get a funny message from somebody and it, crashes your phone, and you kind of might have an idea that your phone was just hacked and give your phone to a security expert or throw it away or something. The types of exploits that they were able to perform on iMessages made it so they had total control of the phone whenever they wanted to, without the user having the slightest idea that that's what was happening. And they could actually do this day after day. They didn't even bother to try to stay on the device. They would just hack you again and again, maybe daily, using this stuff. And the other thing that was happening this year was Apple was rolling out a series of improvements to iMessages that were improvements and worth doing, but were implicitly telling the world or advertising the world how broken iMessage's security model is. So iMessages is one of the first apps Apple's ever made. So the code goes way back. It's extremely complicated. It has a ton of features. You can send Bitmojis and pew pew and whatever. Like, it does a ton of stuff. The video calling, everything.
But does that complexity kind of make it a hackable mess?
Okay, yeah. So this is the implicit thing. I guess I should have underlined that for the audience. Whenever you make software that does a ton of stuff, there's a ton of opportunities for it to screw up, and a ton of places where it can screw up, and it becomes very hard to lock down all of those places. So Apple's got this old project, old code. It's also written in Apple's initial preferred language for iPhone, Objective-C, which is a memory unsafe language, which opens up this large class of attacks for hackers, where they're able to send you a Bitmoji that is a little different and confuses the Bitmoji processor, and is able to use a bit more memory than is expected by that parser. They can start to write to memory that should not be written to, and sometimes you can use that in order to take over someone's device and spy on them and track them and jail them and kill them and whatever. In these, as was happening in the case of the NSO hacks. And so the thing with iMessages, the thing with iMessages is Apple started announcing steps to tamp down on this. They announced this tool Blastdoor, which was a parser for incoming messages written in Swift, which is Apple's new language, which is memory safe, which means it doesn't have this large class of bugs. It's still, it still is exploitable, but it's a lot harder to exploit. And they announced this and said, okay, this will help. But the NSO group attacks, we know, were happening after the deployment of that Blastdoor. So, it maybe helped a bit, but iMessage is still a steaming pile of crap when it comes to security, was the moral of the story. And the craziest thing, given Apple's total control of the platform, is that you cannot uninstall iMessages. And unlike any other app that is like a complex messaging app, or almost any other app, iMessages receives these complex messages from anyone in the world because it is an SMS app. You don't do like a friend request pattern. There's no like, hey, do you want to message with me pattern in iMessages. It's your SMS app. And you can't choose any other SMS app. On Android, you can use Signal as your SMS app, or you could write your own SMS app, or you could disable it entirely. You cannot do that on iPhone because they control everything. So there was this awful situation where we knew that there's a company selling tools to governments that they're misusing en masse all over the world to, and the company knew they were misusing them, but to in some cases kill people. And the only thing you can do, again, is take out your iPhone and smash it with a hammer. There's nothing the user can control about their phone that would limit this company's ability to use these exploits. Because
if your iPhone was a house, it would just be it would be built with a door that's permanently open, or that they're, or an unlockable, or an unlockable screen door or something like that.
And a door with like a special master key that, we can play with the analogies, but the crazy thing is that you would be legally, contractually, technically, almost physically prohibited from doing anything about that.
Right.
It's like, there's just no analogy in the physical world for anything like this. Because you can always change your stuff if it's behaving badly or if it's not working. With an Apple product, it can be actively endangering you, and you cannot change that thing. And that's a conscious decision they made. And the reason why they made that decision, there's even interesting stuff in the Epic lawsuit where Epic has, like, through discovery, internal Apple emails where they talk about, maybe we should make iMessages for other platforms. And, what's like the role of iMessages. And there's like an Apple executive, I think it was at EQ, but it's one of the, or it's either Q or Federighi or one of those folks saying, old guard Apple saying, no, we shouldn't make Apple Messages for other platforms. Apple Messages is what keeps iPhone users, is what keeps iPhone families. It's like you get on Messages and you start using Messages with the rest of your family. That becomes the standard, and that locks you into iPhone. So they think of Messages as a way to lock users in, and so they are forcing you to use it. They don't want to make it optional. They're only going to make it optional if we drag them kicking and screaming to. Probably it'll require legislation. There is actually, just this week, legislation was introduced that would require Apple to give users a choice over these kinds of things, which is awesome. But yeah, and so, but that the pattern here this year has been that while we've been having a conversation over whether Apple should have this unprecedented power to control devices that they sell to their customers long after the moment of sale through software, we've actually been seeing all these harms that have resulted from Apple's power to control devices long after the moment of sale. And it's just been vividly illustrated, at first by NSO Group and Pegasus, and Apple's insistence on making iMessages mandatory, and now by Apple themselves.
Well, from the executive standpoint, it deciding to retain, users, how should I say this? It's particularly insidious to me to hear that Apple, who must be aware of these exploits and what's happening to journalists and activists in other countries, are making the conscious decision to keep iMessages as a uninstallable application with the express intention of retaining users. And seriously, like, you can spin this analogy however you want, but the only way that I see it is that they really are choosing profit over, the lives of political dissidents, activists, and journalists.
Yeah, it's a similar situation. Yeah, and the censorship in China issue, or the censorship broadly, the global censorship of apps, is another situation where they do that. They profit from, and they both directly in terms of the app tax and indirectly in terms of the control they're able to exert over the platform from not letting users install apps from the web. The direct result of
talk
that.
About the App Store a little bit.
Yeah. Okay.
Continue, but yeah, I have some App Store specific questions.
But just to round it out, it's really similar. So in the case of iMessages, they benefit by locking iPhone users into iMessages, and they harm anyone for whom iMessages is a terrible security leak. And they do that semi-knowingly. On the App Store side, they benefit by locking people into the platform because they get the revenue from the app tax, and they also benefit more broadly from just the power they're able to exert over the platform, the things they're able to force people to do, like use Apple Payments, use Apple this or Apple that, or they can kind of force apps to work a certain way. And who they harm by doing that is anyone in a country that does not successfully all the time block the web, but can send Apple a letter, has created the legal authority where they can censor apps by saying certain apps are illegal in their country, and send Apple a letter saying this app is illegal, please take it down. So any place in the world, and there's a large number of jurisdictions where this is the case, where you have an authoritarian government that does not have total censorship capability over the web, where, for example, you could install a VPN, or you could, Tor still works. If Apple allowed install from web, the App Store would not effectively be censored. But because Apple does not allow install from web, Apple's in a position where they have to collaborate with the local government and follow local law and dutifully censor stuff on behalf of whatever screwed up, illegitimate authoritarian is telling them to, right?
So last time you were on, we talked about this App Store stuff. I don't know if we exactly went where we are right now, but like, do you have any updates about what's going on with Apple and like any more like info on the the App Store censorship stuff?
Um, let's see. In terms of updates, oh yeah, well, the biggest thing is there's legislation now. I should look it up, but I just want to know that look up the bill name. Just dropped this week, I believe. So yeah, the bill led by Senators Marsha Blackburn, who was, I'm smiling because their office was a opponent of ours in net neutrality, but it's great to see that they're completely and utterly on the right side on this. And Richard Blumenthal in Connecticut, it's called the Open App Markets Act. Former presidential candidate Amy Klobuchar is also a sponsor. Yeah, so bipartisan support. And it is a bill that would, let's see, the substance of it is that would make it so that you cannot, you can install alternate app stores. You can effectively, what Apple calls sideload, what I would just call install or install from web applications. And I think it also, yeah, there's stuff about limits people's ability, limits companies' abilities to dictate what types of payment processors apps use or something like that explicitly. I haven't read the bill language yet. So again, I'm talking about this as someone who's just following the news like you, but with this additional context. The fact that there's legislation on the table is great. There already has been some state legislation about this. I believe this is the first federal level legislation we've seen. And in the States, Apple has just been swatting these things like flies. Like the legislation has cropped up thanks to the work of activists in different states. Sometimes it's like similar folks that work on right to repair activism in these states. Apple just comes in, spends a bunch of money, and whacks it. And that's been happening so far. But I think it'll be harder for them to do that at the federal level. And it's great that this is being discussed now. Now, passing legislation over an organized adversary as large as Apple is difficult. And the bill also targets Google. So you have Apple and Google in a position to want this to die. It will be, I don't know what this bill's chances of passing are. Or what for example, like, would Biden veto this or not? Like, I would hope not, but I don't know. But it's great that it's being discussed. I think that's the big news. I don't know if there's other news in the Epic case.
Seems like the Epic thing is just going to go on and on. It's going to take a long time, I think, to get to the bottom of that. Yeah,
and I think I would hope that there's stuff happening in the EU, but I don't know that there is. But since I first found out that Apple, since Apple first launched their platform, or probably maybe even before, my position on this is that kind of thing should just be illegal. There should be a law that says when you buy a device, you are allowed to run whatever software you want on it. You can write your own software, you can download software, you can switch your OS, like it is yours. And if companies don't have the foresight or conscience or basic sense of human dignity to give people that voluntarily, then there should be a law that requires them to. There's a famous, there's a great essay on this called "The Right to Read" that folks should go back and it's worth checking out. That long before any company was really using this type of capability, kind of predicted what it would be like in a sort of dystopian way, and is very it pretty much named it named several of the types of harms that would happen.
Well, I think that's about all we've got for this week. So I really appreciate you taking the time to come on and chat with me about this, and the update on the App Store stuff was cool. It's always fun to follow up the previous episode.
Well, there's one more thing we could talk about if you want to go just a little longer.
Please, yeah, we've got time.
So we've been talking about the only thing you can do with Apple pushes you software that you don't want is, not use Apple. Um, I think I think a lot of us do use Apple. I think probably Tech for the Future, probably many, if not most, or all of Tech for the Future users have Macs and use them or Tech for the Future employees have Macs and use them daily. I think Apple has been slower to lock down Mac, but they are proceeding in this direction. So the CSAM scanning stuff will happen on Mac, and the um, Apple has been sort of turning the screws gradually, kind of frog in boiling water, everybody to the point where you won't be able to install the apps you want on your Mac either without a signature from Apple. It's not quite there yet, but they put up a lot of hurdles. So I ship an app for Mac, and it was annoying to get the key to be able to ship a Mac app that did not make the user jump through a series of.
Yeah, installing something outside of the App Store is a pain in the butt.
Yeah, not just selling, but even providing.
Yeah.
And doing it in the App Store is probably even more of a pain in the butt. But anyway, both Macs and iPhones are, if Apple continues in this direction, are becoming kind of untenable as a place to be for someone who cares about this stuff. And the tough thing is that, if you're very, very busy all the time, switching to desktop Linux on a laptop, and the possibility that you'll install an update at some point and your Wi-Fi won't work. I don't know if that still happens, but that used to happen a lot. And that's a lot of people's memory of desktop Linux from back when they would mess with it. It's tough. So there's this process of thinking about, okay, what are we actually going to do? What are we actually going to switch to? And a lot of people are going through this now and thinking about it. The step I'm taking, that just I think desktop Linux is probably my second choice, and first I'm going to try Chrome OS with desktop Linux in a VM inside it. A lot of folks I know who really care about security and are very aware about security would recommend Chrome OS as their top choice against a broad range of threat models. Perhaps accepting the threat model of the US government. Like if the US government wants to hack you, you probably shouldn't use Chrome OS, but if the attackers are other people, then it's probably a good bet. And then, and then lately Chrome lets you run Linux inside it in a VM, which is actually kind of nice because pretty much all operating systems should work this way. When you run apps, they should be running in a VM and have very limited access to the rest of your machine, so that if you accidentally run something that includes malicious code, you have a degree of protection. So that's probably what I'm going to do. I'm curious what you're thinking about for your setup. What are you thinking about for your setup?
Yeah, so right now I do all of outside of the podcast, I do a lot of video work at Fight for the Future. So my MacBook has actually been really helpful, and I'm not entirely sure. Like, I know that a lot of the Adobe applications that I use run on Windows, so that's probably what I would do, because I like doing creative work. I can't do any of that on Chrome OS. I think a lot of people can probably get by on the setup that you were describing, but for creatives, I think Windows is probably the way to go, at least for now. I don't think that Adobe Suite is really available on Linux. If it was, I would certainly consider it, though.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know what the state of Wine is running. Like, Wine was the Windows environment for Linux. What you can run, you can certainly run VMs on. So you could have a Linux desktop running a VM that's running Windows, and there might be, using VirtualBox or QEMU or something. And I bet those work pretty well. Now, I haven't looked into them, but my guess is that they work very well. I mean,
How would they handle something that's more graphically intensive, though, do you think?
I think
rendering video and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it either works or it doesn't. So it either is able to do acceleration or not. I think that, one cool thing that's happened in the past 10 years is that, since Apple started doing this crap, is that virtualization has become the main way. Virtual machines have become the main way that software gets deployed to the cloud. So stuff like Docker, Cloudflare workers or Amazon. I mean, I'm kind of mixing and matching a bunch of different things here, but I'm mixing a bunch of different ideas here, but virtualization has become a sort of first class way of doing things. And so it's also gotten better and more reliable on desktop. But yeah, I don't know. I know one other thing that's interesting is that the company Parallels that makes the tools that let you run Windows apps on Mac now makes a tool that lets enterprise users run Windows apps or Windows desktops on Chrome OS. But it's sort of like you can't just download it as an individual user. The site looks like you have to kind of call them and set up a like sales rep or something, or find someone who will sell it to you. I don't know if that's true, but it just in my quick research, it looked like it kind of wasn't available for most users yet. But if that becomes more broadly available, that would be great too, because then you could have Chrome OS for anything you do on the web, a Linux VM inside that, which you can already do for anything that you don't want to put on the web, or multiple Linux VMs, and then a Windows VM for like, Adobe tools and things like that.
And for non creative work, Chrome OS is awesome. I used it for years and years, and I've been on this MacBook for quite a while because of the video work. But just for most people, I kind of like Chrome more than a desktop OS.
I mean, I would just say, when we're talking about Chrome OS, we're talking about a substitute for the stuff that you do on the web. You will not be more safe or secure or private if you use Chrome OS for anything that you would not already do on the web.
Yeah.
And that's a danger with Chrome OS that's really worth underlining. Like if you start using Google Docs instead of using a local text editor, just because you're on Chrome OS, you're becoming less private. Or at least, it depends on your threat model, but that's probably less secure and not recommended. But if you're using it as a substitute, or if you're using Chrome OS for all the things that you do on the web, and then you're running Linux inside it for all the things that you do not do on the web, that's probably all right. And then of course, desktop Linux is the best thing you can do if that's convenient for you and you have a clear path to doing it.
Well, cool. I mean, I appreciate you adding this on at the end. I hadn't thought to ask about it, but it was actually really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, and on the phone side, we just need to get off iPhone, and Graphene OS is a hardened version of Android that has a lot of the Google stuff, or all of the Google stuff, pulled out. So you're sort of unplugged from both Apple and Google if you go that route. But a transitional step would just be to install, vanilla Android, one of the make sure you get an Android phone that doesn't come with a budget carrier and manufacturer hardware.
And for iPhone people who really care about hardware design and stuff, like I've been using Pixels for a long time. This is funny because people are kind of teasing us in the chat that we trust Google and like Google or something, but
yeah,
the Pixel phones are really nice. I wouldn't say that we, just to address it, I wouldn't say that we put our trust in Google exactly.
Yeah, that was my point about Chrome OS. That's important.
Yeah.
If you use Chrome on your desktop, you can use Chrome OS for that on, but you should not trust, especially if your threat model includes the US government. Yeah. You should not trust Google products. You should make sure that if you're using Android, you're using the hardware, you're using Android hardware with free, ideally hardened OSs that have the Google pieces pulled out. And that, whether that's more secure is a sort of I'm not actually sure. It depends on your threat model. I mean, the answer with security is it always depends on your threat model. And you probably, if your security needs are high, you need to build a network of people who can advise you on them and help you work through those questions. And so we're definitively not saying that you should trust Google or trust Android, but we are saying that you should not trust any company that sells you something and says we still have control over this, haha, and then shoves functionality you don't want down your throat on a Friday afternoon.
Yeah,
and that there's a difference. The same way there's a difference between a mess up democracy and a total dictatorship, there is a difference between having code forced down your throat that you're required to use and a company that, and a product that lets you install your own code, lets you switch out the OS if you want to. And if you don't, tries to monetize your data. It's messed up, but it's an entirely different level of messed up than a company that shoves software down your throat.
But yeah, for iPhone users who are looking for nice hardware, the Pixel phones are actually very nice hardware. I've been using them forever, and I do recommend them to people.
People say, especially the cameras, that you don't miss the iPhone camera when you switch to Pixel, which is a big thing with a lot of Android phones. And this stuff is changing all the time. And I don't know. I mean, I think that the biggest question really is what are the dynamics around the next big platform shift? And it seems likely that AR and VR is the next big platform shift, because if we had AR and VR, I could just be hanging out with you, Joe, and maybe some viewers could be hanging out with us, and there'd be like a little panel discussion stage with an audience, and and I wouldn't need a computer.
I expect that to happen and intend eventually.
Yeah, that's where this is going. I mean, why would you have a computer with a bunch of screens here if you can just have a computer with a bunch of screens like right here? So that shift is happening. Apple and Facebook have enormous teams working on this. I assume Google does as well. And none of it is really, I mean, Facebook stuff is semi-public, but a lot of the stuff they're working on, I mean, there's public, they're reporting on it, but it's not just like Quest 2 or something. There's a lot of stuff they're working on that's not Quest 2. And I think something like 20% or 18% of Facebook employees are currently working on AR VR. If you want to be,
that's wild.
Slightly, yeah. So, and I bet at Apple there's something similar happening. So, it would be great to win some of these fights about user control of software now before we have something on our faces that we have no control over, and it's owned by Apple or Facebook, and everybody else does.
With eye tracking and stuff, they know what you're looking at. They know how much time they can follow your gaze around the virtual environment and glean a lot of very profitable info just from VR behavior, I'm sure. And I'm sure they're figuring out how to maximize that at Facebook right now.
Yeah, and the difficult thing here is that like the more hardware gets small and specialized to certain types of new specific purposes, the more economies of scale kick in and the more institutional expertise becomes a factor. And with 20 years ago, I would have thought, oh, well, someone will just make some free hardware or make like the open source version and it'll be fine. But with that has not happened with watches even, right? There isn't a more open, credible competitor to Apple Watch, at least not until very recently. So I'm really worried that whatever company invests the most in this and gets the head start up front is going to have a huge advantage and a huge amount of power just based on the economies of scale and the expertise, the new kinds of expertise that they develop, that they build in-house in order to tackle that set of problems. It's going to be really
who's been weirdly good on this, and it's on, not to knock gamers exactly, like I love playing video games myself, but Valve has, have you heard about their Steam Deck? Are you familiar with that at all? So like their hardware runs on Linux. They're very adamant about saying, you can install any app store on this. It's a feature of the product. So they're like, I wish that it was something that wasn't a game console, but they are very committed to having it be super open. And I think that's really cool.
Yeah.
And I wish more companies were like that.
I don't get how I don't understand how you can be a software developer for long enough to get good at anything and not understand how important this stuff is. But I guess it happens, but like I don't know how the rank and file at Apple, for example, aren't just like livid about or aren't just like completely discouraged every day when they go to work and know that they're making software that violates like pretty much anything you would ever learn about the politics of technology. Coming up reading Slashdot in the 90s or Hacker News over the past decade, like we know how much this stuff matters, and we know there is an emerging sense of what the rules are. Like you let you, you, openness and choice are the paths that avoid these big shutting downs of human creativity and human potential. And once you start shutting down openness and choice, you start just wasting tremendous human potential and creativity. And we all, so like, yeah, I mean, there's some people, there's tons of people in the space who get that, and some of them start companies, and some of those companies are really successful. I'm surprised and dismayed that that isn't everybody, and that that doesn't include Apple. But yeah, that this is that there are companies that get it for sure.
I don't know
And
if it's really ever been Apple, though. I mean, that's been as far back as they go, been the criticism of that their, you know, that their system is totally closed off,
yeah, it's a funny mix of
like in their
things.
DNA.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, there's a lot of interesting. Yeah, I mean, how can you go from something that's like, you know, that starts with like Stuart Brand and the whole Earth catalog, or something like in the 60s counterculture, and then kind of gets to this point, and you know, or give Ridley Scott a giant pile of money to make an amazing advertisement that's about oppression and about, you know, 1984 and how the future of computing will be 1984, and then do exactly that. I mean, it's be careful who you trust, right? It's like anyone, and it's the same thing with the privacy ads they have now. A
I
company
mean,
that
I've always found
a
Steve
company
Jobs
that
to
puts,
be.
sorry.
I was just saying, I've always found Steve Jobs to be really paradoxical because, like you were saying, he does come out of like the 60s, like free, like openness, like movement, and they say it all throughout, like think different and all this stuff. But when it comes down to it, what he built is like fundamentally authoritarian. Like it's bizarre.
Well, okay, I would say it has an authoritarian streak. I mean, I think there is something about, there's also something authoritarian about software that's bureaucratic, or that's like needlessly sticklerish, or that's just not working, right? Systems that are broken are authoritarian too, in a way. And so I think probably for a long time they felt like they were enhancing people's freedom by saving them from a mess of stuff that just wasn't working, because we didn't know how to make stuff work very well. But I think the agile revolution, when I say agile revolution, I mean like this over the past 20 or so years, this um, strain of thinking in software development that comes out of like strains of thinking in industrial product development, like at companies like Toyota in the 80s, I think, that then makes it into software. And you get ideas like, you know, um, doing like minimal incremental improvements, and uh, constant user feedback, and constant sort of cycles of like making sure that the things you're doing are needed by users, and that you're on the right track, and not just adding a bunch of crufty code that's broken. Um, the the software development community has gotten a lot better at making stuff that just works and that is not. And Apple is no longer by far the only game in town in that sense. And in some ways, they are lagging behind when it comes to making highly usable stuff. You know, I think that not necessarily lagging behind in the end result, but lagging behind in the methodology in a way that puts them behind the end result sometimes. Anyway, I don't think we need Apple anymore to make stuff that is easy enough to use, that it increases people's freedom. Mm-hmm. And maybe that was an important role to play at some point, and that Apple could say, you know, we're enhancing freedom by making stuff that's easy to use, even if it means locking it down, or restraint, like putting that in a cage in some way. Now I just don't think that's the case anymore. We don't need them for that. And
well, so much design now, so much software design now is web design anyway. Like we were saying, you can get by on Chrome OS pretty well without having to actually run anything, because that it just makes things so elegant and usable when they're web apps. Yeah, and it does kind of fix what they were trying to fix.
Yeah. And a lot of that has to do with all the open source software running behind the scenes
Yeah.
And that is built up over time to make the job of developing software easy. And a lot of the open standards work that happens in web browsers, where the goal is to make clear ways for interacting with these tools that the user interacts with. And I don't know, yeah, but the last thought I had is, when you see the privacy billboards up around New York City, or or in major cities for Apple, and there's something the size of a building saying privacy, we're the privacy company, or what happens on your phone stays on your phone. There's this great Herman Melville book that person wrote Moby Dick, a book that no one really talks about or reads that much, called Confidence Man, where he talks about, it's kind of this surreal long story about a very kind of amorphous set of characters who later turns out to be maybe a single character, but ambiguously. And it's all about the con artist, and it's all about being tricked and swindled. And the swindler always says, trust us. And the swindler always talks about trust, and there are all these amazing dialogues where the con artist says, be, no one really believes in anything anymore. No one really trusts in things anymore. Isn't that a shame? And we'll talk to the person that they're conning about the importance of trust in this really explicit way. And the author just hammers on this. And I don't know, I think it's a really important lesson for the world, is when you say the loudest people saying trust us, and I think it's a trap that activists fall into sometimes too. The easiest route is to say trust us, but you shouldn't. I mean, the loudest voices saying trust us are always the ones you should trust the least.
Yeah, and with the way that software is designed, trust can be self-evident in open source code.
Yeah.
Nobody needs to say it. It should be obvious.
Trust systems and structure. Don't trust corporations, or unless they're people and like a lot, people.
Yeah. Holmes, thank you very much for taking the time. This is probably our longest one that we've ever done. I appreciate you coming on and chatting. This was super interesting. And hopefully we'll have a good reason to have you back again in the future.
Yeah.
The streams are back. We were off for like 3 weeks, but we're back to doing it every week. If you liked this, please make sure to give it a like on YouTube. This is also available on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. I always appreciate when people are active in the chat. So hello to the people in the chat. It's always fun to see your messages, and I hope that we addressed as much as we could from that. And yeah, we'll be back sometime next week. It's been changing so much, I'm afraid to give a time and day. So I'll just say we'll be back next week. Keep an eye on our Twitter at Fight for the FTR. And yeah, we'll see everybody again in the future. Bye.
All right. Bye, everyone. Thanks.
All right, we're off the air. It's funny because I said it was